Hey Katie! We have a new book today. We have The Whispering Statue. So let's dive right in with chapter 1, Three-Way Alarm. Nancy, you're kidding. No statue can whisper. A twinkle came into Nancy Drew's blue eyes. She tossed her reddish gold hair and looked at the slender, athletic girl standing in front of her. George, the statue I'm talking about used to whisper before it disappeared. A third girl in the Drews' attractive living room, Bess Marvin, spoke up. Where is this marvel? She was blonde and slightly plump and dark-haired George Fane's cousin. George grinned. The marvelous marble. The other two girls laughed. Nancy said, I don't know anything more about it, but Dad has a client coming to dinner who will explain everything. She has a case for him, and he hinted that he wants you girls and me to help solve a mystery in connection with it. Sounds great, George remarked. Bess, more cautious than her cousin, looked at Nancy. Will it be a nice, straight mystery, or one that's going to scare the wits out of me? Nancy said she knew nothing about the case. Just then, Mr. Drew's car pulled into the circular driveway of his brick colonial home, which stood well back from the street. The front lawn was wide, with attractive shrubs and flowers. He helped a woman of about 40 from the car and escorted her to the front entrance. She was tall, slender, and pretty. Nancy hurried to open the door. Hello, dear, her father said. Nancy, this is Mrs. Merriam. Nancy shook hands, and she and Mrs. Merriam exchanged smiles. I feel so relieved to be here, the caller said. Unwittingly, I seem to have become involved in a mystery with a legal angle to it. Your father was recommended to me as a leading attorney. And he is too, Nancy hastened to say. She took Mrs. Merriam's summer coat and gloves, and the three walked into the living room. Mrs. Merriam, I'd like you to meet my friends, Bess Marvin and George Fane, Nancy said. Smiling, she added, they're part of my detective force, so you may speak freely in front of them. Mrs. Merriam proved to be a charming person. She was introduced to Hannah Gruen, who had been the Drews' housekeeper since Nancy was 3 years old. Upon the death of the little girl's mother, Hannah had assumed the responsibility of helping to rear Nancy. Mrs. Gruen was a level-headed and kindly person who always worried about Nancy while she was solving a mystery. Dinner is served, she announced. Is everyone ready to go to the table? Mr. Drew laughed. Ready and starving. I hope you have some of my favorites tonight. While the Drew family and their guests ate, the lawyer suggested that his new client tell her story. I live in Waterford on the coast, she said. Some time ago, an uncle of mine left me a very fine library of books. Hundreds of them. My home is too small to accommodate them all, so my husband urged me to sell the collection. Horace is away frequently on business and left all the negotiations to me. I went to Willis Basswood in town. He runs a high-class art gallery and bookshop, to see if he could sell the volumes for me. Mrs. Merriam went on to say that Mr. Basswood had agreed and would take 25% of each sale as his fee. At first, everything seemed to go well. Mr. Basswood was able to get a high price for certain volumes, not so much for others. He gave me receipts for everything. Then suddenly the money stopped coming. When I asked him why, he said that the books were not selling. As she paused, Mr. Drew remarked, Now Mrs. Merriam has become suspicious of the man and feels that perhaps he's disposing of them, but not giving her the money. Before the lawyer could explain further, he and the others at the dinner table were startled by the ringing of the front and back doorbells and the telephone. Excuse me, said Mr. Drew, and went toward the front door. Hannah made her way to the back door, while Nancy answered the wall telephone in the kitchen. A harsh voice on the other end of the line asked, Drew residence? Yes, whom do you want? Nancy queried. The caller rasped, You tell Mrs. Merriam to shut up, or she'll get hurt, and you people too. The caller slammed down the instrument. By this time, Hannah had opened the back door. To her amazement, a burly, masked man stepped inside and knocked her to the floor. Simultaneously, there was a yell from the front hall. Bess and George appeared and went to aid Hannah, while Nancy rushed out of the kitchen to help her father. George leaped forward and, with a neat judo hold, tossed Hannah's assailant over on his back. Hannah jumped up, and together she and the girls grabbed the intruder. But he fought fiercely and, with a sharp twist, pulled free and ran out the open door. Meanwhile, Nancy had hurried into the living room. Her father was battling another masked intruder in the hall beyond. The man's mask fell off, and Nancy caught a glimpse of a cruel face with a set jaw and fiery eyes. He was of medium height and muscular. Mrs. Merriam was in the hall crying, "Stop that! Stop that!" The intruder seemed determined to hurt Mr. Drew, who kept dodging blows, but sending back some stinging ones in return. Mrs. Merriam, seeing Nancy, exclaimed, "What will we do?" "Run upstairs and call the police," Nancy directed. Her father's attacker, apparently having heard Nancy's request, suddenly whirled and made a dash to the front steps. Mr. Drew was breathing heavily. Nevertheless, he started out the door after the intruder. Nancy grabbed his arm. "Please don't," she begged. "He may be armed. Let police handle this." She closed the door and picked up the mask, which had fallen to the floor. "This may be a clue to yours and Hannah's attackers, Dad," she said, and told of the man in the kitchen. They hurried there. "He escaped!" Bess cried out.
"I don't understand," the lawyer said, "what those men hope to accomplish."
"My guess is," Nancy replied, "that they wanted to hurt us so we'd be unable to work on Mrs. Merriam's case."
"What makes you think that?"
he asked. Nancy told her father about the warning she'd received over the telephone.
"On the other hand," the lawyer said, "there may be a gang that has a grudge against Willis Basswood."
Although Mr. Drew was upset by what had occurred, he smiled when he heard how George had used her knowledge of judo, so that's a martial art, on Hannah's attacker.
"Good for you," he said. "Can you give a good description of him?"
"Indeed I can," Hannah spoke up indignantly. "I pulled off his mask. He looked like a gorilla." Mrs. Merriam had joined the group and said the police were on their way. "I wish someone would explain what the ruckus was all about." Nancy gave her the phone message, and Mr. Drew said,
"I think, Mrs. Merriam, you may be right in mistrusting Mr. Basswood. Apparently there's a connection between him and those thugs. You must be very careful from now on."
Police sirens wailed, and within seconds 2 cars raced up the driveway. 4 officers jumped out. 3 started to search the grounds, while 1 remained at the front door. By this time, the Drews and their friends had gathered in the living room. The lawyer opened the door and invited the officer inside.
"Which way did your intruder go?" the policeman asked. "There were 2 men, one at the front door and one at the back," Mr. Drew replied. "Who saw which direction the one at the back took?"
Bess and George said that he had gone to the rear of the garden and jumped the hedge. They described him as a strong, heavy-set man with a long scar on his right wrist.
The officer said, "I think we know who he is. It won't be too hard to pick him up. He earns a living as a strong-arm man for the underworld characters."
So basically, he's the muscle for the underworld characters to make people do what they want because they're scared of him. "Oh, how dreadful!" Mrs. Merriam exclaimed. Nancy described the man who had come in by the front door. The 2 masks were examined. They were identical.
"Those thugs were working together all right,"
the officer declared. Then he hurried outside to report to the other men, taking the 2 masks with him. "It's all my fault," Mrs. Merriam berated herself. She was pale and looked as if she were going to faint. As the woman slumped into a chair, Hannah Gruen hurried off to bring her a cup of tea. The hot beverage revived Mrs. Merriam. Looking intently at Nancy and her father, she said, "I think you should give up the case." Nancy was stunned. She was already intrigued by the suspicions against Mr. Basswood. Besides, she thought, I haven't heard the story of the whispering statue. And that's the end of chapter 1. We'll have to find out what happens.